Welcome to episode 45 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. On this April Fool's Day, I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. So let's get started with my first topic. Cisco Live occurred this week. It was the second year in a row that it was a virtual conference. I mean, honestly, buddy, between you and I can't wait to get back on an airplane. So I'm hoping in the second half of the year, things will change, but they did a great job, from my perspective. And what I want to talk about on the podcast are 2 things. One, several announcements related to their re-architecture of the internet and also 5G. So let me start with the first. So it's no secret that their acquisition of Acacia was pretty hardly fought. They had come to an agreement, and then for whatever reason, the company, chose to use China as a negotiation ploy, and they extended that out. Cisco ended up paying a little bit more money for them. But what I'm really impressed about that acquisition is that it brings a capability to allow them to deploy a new routed optical networking infrastructure. And that involves coherent optics. And for those of you that aren't knowledgeable about that, it's very complicated. I'm not a scientist, or an engineer, but I play one on TV. But net, coherent optical technology allows a much faster interconnect between campus connectivity and fiber optic networks. And so they announced, that integration and that rollout along with a lot of other enhancements. I'm actually writing a Forbes article that should post on Friday. So if you go hit @WillTownTech, my Twitter feed, you'll find that article there. But the assumption that Cisco has, and they've been a part of the internet from the very beginning, so they can stake a claim on the internet versus Al Gore, from my perspective. They really want to extend that capability. They want to provide scale and headroom. I mean, COVID has proven that, internet traffic spiked up to 50% in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And then when you start thinking about the future of hybrid work, that, people are going to, continue to work from home, and as they return to, to campus environments as well, there needs to be a re-architecture of the internet from my perspective. So I thought this announcement was, very, very strong. It sort of plays into their strengths with custom silicon, as well as, other things that they're doing around 5G in general. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about was I had an opportunity during exclusive analyst roundtables to ask Jonathan Davidson, who's the Senior Vice President and General Manager of their mass scale infrastructure group, what their focus is around private 5G, because they've been somewhat quiet. And, my question was, I mean, do you view this as, just selling equipment, as a managed service, or both? And, I wasn't surprised to hear that they believe the right go-to-market path, at least for Cisco, is to focus on, managed service offerings, which might be a little bit different than Nokia's take on, wanting to sell, the infrastructure and that sort of thing. And there's certainly a lot of startups like Solana that I've talked about on prior podcasts that are focused on 5G as a service. But what's also interesting at Cisco Live, they announced their foray into networking as a service. So this fits very well within that broader overarching plan. It's no secret that, companies are embracing SaaS. And if you look at, Hewlett Packard with GreenLake, and you look at Dell with their Apex as a service announcement, Cisco might be a tad late to the party, but certainly they have great capabilities to deliver not only the needed infrastructure to provide scale for future internet connectivity, but also for 5G. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I hope they don't call it NAS, because that's already taken.
Yeah.
But I think Cisco has always been kind of the incumbent player in the networking industry. Mm-hmm. And they've done a really good job of maintaining their position in the market as a market leader. maybe not necessarily the market leader every single time, but they tend to understand which trends are relevant on a macro scale. So I think they might not be always be the first, but when they have a more integrated solution and with more mature products, I think that they do have a lot of opportunities still.
Yeah, and they've actually added a lot of capabilities through acquisitions. Acacia is one of them. There are numerous, announcements. Thousand Eyes, which brings improved observability to enterprise networking in general, which could be leveraged there as well. What I like about Cisco is that they have all these capabilities. To your point, not always, leading in certain categories, but certainly from an optical standpoint, they are a leader. And if you think about their footprint, they are the largest, networking provider in the world, and they can really lean into that enterprise install base to deploy things like private cellular 5G networking. So it's a combination of having the right route to market in my mind, and having the right pieces to put together. And I think they have a very strong recipe to be successful there. So we'll keep our eyes on that. This is a new announcement. Again, go hit my Twitter feed if you'd like to read my Forbes analysis and insights into all of the other announcements also around Cisco Live. But let's move to your first topic this week, and you want to talk about Samsung and mid-band for 5G.
Yeah, so Samsung announced new mid-band hardware, specifically hardware capable of delivering 400 megahertz channel width on the mid bands. So obviously there's many different mid bands out there today. But what's interesting is this new hardware, which is designed for massive MIMO, will allow operators to essentially roll out one piece of hardware, even if they don't have continuous spectrum across all mid bands. So they could have, all of their different blocks of spectrum operating on the same equipment. And one of the big things was that operators can use this for RAN sharing as well, which isn't necessarily something that matters in the US market, but there are some operators in Europe that are doing it. So
they are.
This is definitely a more Eurocentric play, I believe. But I also think there will be applications, especially for C-band, where Samsung has an opportunity, because I think that there's going to be pretty, disjointed blocks of spectrum once everything's, rolled out. While I don't think Samsung has necessarily signed any explicit deals to roll out mid-band in the US for any specific carrier, they do already have a relationship with Verizon. So there is a possibility that that could be where they land in the US, but it definitely looks a little bit more European centric. But honestly, it could work anywhere that mid-band's rolling out. And, no one's going to have 400 megahertz of continuous spectrum. 200 is already pushing it. But what I think is that having that 400 megahertz gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of spectrum that you can acquire, or spectrum that you already have that might not be contiguous in that band.
Yeah, and having one solution that covers all of that, also from a CapEx perspective, is quite compelling for operators as well. And I agree with you. You're seeing some, RAN sharing in Europe, not necessarily the US, but you mentioned a very good point. Verizon has been, keenly partnered with Samsung Networks in their 5G rollouts for fixed wireless access and mobility. And, given what they spent, at the C-band auction, north of $45 billion, it might be interesting to see, how they leverage this platform. So, so we'll keep our eyes on it for sure.
I was also going to say that it's likely that Samsung offers a more price competitive solution than some of the other more incumbent players for the sake of growing its business and getting market share. So that's also an opportunity, I believe.
No, that's an excellent point, because when you look at the traditional, infrastructure providers that have been strong in RAN, it's really been Nokia and Ericsson, and Samsung hasn't had necessarily a strong footprint in the RAN space. So I totally agree with you. That's a great observation. Let's move to my second topic this week, and that's a great segue into Ericsson. They announced this week the opening of a lab. They're calling it the Open Lab, and it's really focused around vRAN and their Cloud RAN announcement that I believe that they've really taken a leadership position on. But this is interesting because when you think about Ericsson and Nokia, they've been very resistant in the past to the whole notion of open and disaggregation because that sort of blows up their business model around end to end. Although Nokia, with their new leadership, has come out and said, we realize that not every operator or service provider wants to consume end to end. They want to consume best of breed, and so Nokia has been a little more flexible. Obviously, they've been very supportive of Open RAN. Ericsson and Huawei, not as much. So I think this is a great step for Ericsson. I mean, I call it the open tsunami.
I was just going to say something about that.
Yeah, and if they decide to bury their head in the sand or bury their head in the wave, they could get totally passed by. And so I think this is a step in the right direction. Now, will they go kicking and screaming, along with Open RAN? Time will tell. But I think this sort of opens, the kind of the discussion, at least internally with Ericsson, from my perspective, on really seriously embracing what is coming down the pipe. So I'm sure you've got some perspective on this as well.
Yeah, I think, first of all, everybody has some kind of open lab now. That seems to be the choice of name.
Du jour.
Yeah, everyone has some kind of 5G open lab for something related to 5G. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see who has, who works with them in terms of interoperability to make this possible. And that's why they need the lab, right? But I think that eventually, at least when we're talking about Open RAN, I think everyone will have adopted it at one point or another, at varying degrees. But I think it's going to be an inevitability, especially with U.S. operators spending as much as they have on spectrum.
C-band, yeah, C-band especially, and we've talked about that on prior podcasts. My hypothesis is that I think of all the three tier ones in the U.S., Verizon's really going to have to embrace it because they're the ones that stepped up and spent the 45+ billion on C-band, an incremental 8 to 10 billion to densify their network, and so it's going to be a major infrastructure play, and so we'll keep our eyes and ears open with respect to developments here. But let's move to your second topic this week. You want to talk about Huawei. I did catch their earnings. It looked like they had pretty strong growth in China, but there are a lot of folks that are doubting, can they sustain that given the entity listing and all the challenges that they have in the US? So why don't you provide your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario. It's also a very complicated one.
Yeah.
But basically, the top line is that Huawei's revenue was up 3.6 or 3.8 year over year. So, and that's compared to 2019, where they had an increase of 5.6 in profit and 19% in revenue. Yeah. So, it's not a great situation for the company because they had a lot of momentum going their way. And China, like you mentioned, was their best bright spot, where they had 15% growth, while they had 12% drop in Europe, an 8.7% drop in Asia, and a 25% drop in the Americas. So it's not a great situation for Huawei, especially with all the entity listings and restrictions and fab supply issues. But it seemed like most of the business hit was on the consumer side, not on the infrastructure side. That was something that had been impressed upon us when we spoke with Huawei prior to the announcement, under NDA. But essentially, the situation is that they have to find a way to create a middle ground with the U.S. government. I actually don't think that their devices are necessarily the security risk as much as their network infrastructure theoretically could be.
Could be, yeah.
Right? I think that's an important thing to consider because smartphones are not, I mean, Huawei's smartphones were banned by the US government within its own use for a while. So it just doesn't make sense. But that all aside, I do think that there can be a potential middle ground where Huawei says, okay, we won't use our chips anymore for our phones. We'll use a Qualcomm or a MediaTek, and we will put that in our phones, and that will be the compromise that we make with you to allow us to continue to ship our phones. Now, on the infrastructure side, I'm not entirely sure what kind of agreements can be reached there, because the U.S. had pushed for Huawei to be pushed out in a lot of countries. But I think that Huawei does have a path forward, and it seems to be that they are diversifying their business beyond just network infrastructure and smartphones to increase its 5G patent incomes, and to look at automotive opportunities, and to kind of expand the company's breadth into IoT, so that way it isn't necessarily impacted as heavily by US sanctions or very specific, industry specific regulations. So I think that Huawei is not going anywhere. But even to their own words, I have a feeling that 2021 is going to be a very difficult year for them. I think that they started the year very rough, like everybody else did, and had a big bounce back when things started to go back to normal in China. But the reality is that they're probably going to have a difficult Q1 and Q2, and it's going to be a really difficult 2021 for them. But I get a sense that they're already kind of shifting the direction of the ship a little bit, to account for the changing world.
Yeah, I would agree. And, just to remind folks, I mean, Huawei is a massive company, probably one of the largest, if not the largest, technology companies in China, $120+ billion in revenue. So to even have a 3%, revenue, increase year over year is massive. And, not only are they into cellular networking infrastructure, but they have an enterprise networking business unit as well. It's quite small relative to their cellular infrastructure business. It's probably, I haven't looked recently, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 billion in US revenue. And that could be a pivot, area away from them. But I agree with you that I think the concerns are more around the infrastructure and not the smartphone. I think, and I think you're spot on. If they start using merchant, SoCs and modems and that sort of things in their smartphones, like from Qualcomm, like from MediaTek, that could have, kind of allayed some fears. I think another fear that I've heard is that, with their Kirin, chipsets, they were integrating AI, and I think that might scare, a lot of, at least, government officials in the U.S. It's like, oh my goodness, like Chinese AI in a smartphone, can that spy on, can you spy on people? Sort of like the concern around, your integrated webcam on, your computer, and so many people that like to cover them up with a piece of tape or a sticky note. So I think, that might be one way for them, to sort of allay those fears, is to use more of the kind of industry standard, silicon in their solutions. But we'll keep an eye out on this, and as things develop, we'll report back. Let's move to my third and final topic this week. And there's been a lot of discussion. I don't want to wax politics, but the Biden administration has proposed a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. Part of that includes their desire to bridge the digital divide within the next 10 years. And I haven't drilled into kind of the details around that. But obviously, that would involve, subsidies and that sort of thing for operators. But what strikes me as really ironic, and I'm not sure if that administration really understands the ins and outs of all this, and we've talked about this before, if the FCC continues to take spectrum money to the bank, that's going to be counterproductive, because I believe, you can bifurcate this into a number of different areas. It's about, cable, modem, for broadband access. It could be, fixed wireless access. It could be, a number of different, sort of modalities that sort of come together here. But, there seems to be, sort of a schizophrenic, approach by the government, by the U.S. government at least. And so, number one, the easiest way to speed, 5G deployment in my mind and get FWA out there to some of these outlying areas is to quit taking the money to the bank. So, what are your thoughts?
I think from what I've seen is that there are some people like the WISPA VP of Government Affairs said they think the plan is on target for what's needed. I think your analysis of the situation is fair, but I also think it forgets that most of the taking to the bank that we've had was partially initiated by the previous administration that tried to run the government like a business, which I personally don't really believe is necessarily the way we should be running our spectrum auctions, because that is kind of like it gets passed down to the consumer, which is the taxpayer.
Sure.
So I think this $100 billion potential plan to build high-speed broadband networks throughout the country is something that we've needed for the last 50 years and should have been done 50 years ago, but wasn't done because nobody held the operators accountable for it. We've been paying these fees for a long time, so it needs to be done. And I think one of the biggest things is that we have to look at where we can deploy gigabit when it's possible, and also deploying as much bandwidth in as many places as possible, because ultimately the countries that will succeed the most in the next century will be the ones that are most interconnected with the most bandwidth. And if we're not going to solve our real estate problems that we have in this country, we might as well let people live where they want to live and be able to work from anywhere. And that's partially, I think, what's going to be enabled by this potential investment in broadband in this $2.3 trillion infrastructure package, is to allow people to remain where they are today when they've decided to leave the cities due to COVID, and allow them to live anywhere that they choose, which I think is optimal because it potentially reduces the burden on big cities to densify aggressively.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of spanked the operators there in your commentary. They're in the business to make a profit, and
Absolutely.
it's subscriber density that allows you to retire your your investment in infrastructure, and it's purely economics. And I agree with you. I think there needed to be more done in the past to bridge the digital divide. It's not a simple scenario, and this proposal is quite expensive. And I'm of the mindset that there needs to be a balance between a number of different things. And so again, we don't have the time to figure this out between you and I, but on this podcast. But it'll be interesting to kind of keep tabs on this and see how things develop. But I think you and I are pretty much in agreement on most of these core issues. So, but let's move to your third and final topic this week. And again, it's no secret that Qualcomm has had to battle its way out of court for a number of reasons. And it sounds like this week the FTC finally cried uncle.
Yeah, so I mean they've been pursuing this this lawsuit ever since the end of the Obama administration. So it's basically been a 4-year saga.
Yeah.
In the last days of the Obama administration, this was filed. And honestly, anyone who understands the core tenets of this lawsuit and the way our industry works knew that this lawsuit really didn't make much sense from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And our principal analyst and founder, Patrick Moorhead, has written considerably on this topic, and has kind of said that it's important to account for patents and intellectual property as being valuable, and how important this case would have been if it made it to the Supreme Court, which it did not.
Yeah.
But I think the really important thing to consider is the Ninth District Court completely eviscerated the FTC's case after they got a favorable judgment from Judge Koh, who's famous for a lot of these very high profile cases.
Yeah, in tech,
And I mean, even her tech was very off the mark, and really didn't represent the realities of what's going on in the market today, or even at that time when the lawsuit was filed. So I think what's really interesting about the whole case is that the case that was pushed by the FTC was proven wrong over the course of that case's running through the courts, because it said that it caused the harm to the industry. But if you look at the industry, it has thrived, and market share has shifted, and new players have gained market share and grown. So it really doesn't support the case that they had. And I just think that they gave their case up when they realized that the Supreme Court wasn't really going to get involved.
Yeah, and when you're as big as Qualcomm and you're such a large part of cellular networking in general, certainly 5G, it's easy to paint a target on their back, right? Because they're big, and it's like, oh, because they're big, they've got to be anti-competitive. But again, I think a lot of these judicial folks and a lot of our government representation doesn't understand tech to the extent that they need to, and that was quite evident during the the Facebook hearings a couple of years ago, right? It was almost embarrassing. So so it's like it's no secret, but yeah, like you mentioned, Patrick, our principal has written, extensively on this, and it's good to see that, finally Qualcomm, they got their day in court multiple times, but this was able to be resolved in their favor. So, but hey, buddy, it was another great podcast. Really enjoyed the conversation. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at WillTownTech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune again next week.